Right, here is another absolutely splendid place to sit and read, especially in a day like this where it's blowing hard from the northwest and we're sheltered by the peninsula down, as you can see, on the sea. But to my slight surprise, we've got a little bit of a swell. It must be just building up from the north, even though it's really northwesterly blowing. But so today's book, this is the second and last one I'm going to cover on Scottish party political politics. I think most useful things that need to be said have been said, and I constantly hope that we will just leave things undisturbed and we can concentrate on living. So the book has the slightly clunky title. Ooh, a little cloud over there, but not much, thankfully. Should Old Acquaintance Be Forgot? Subtitled, this is the big giveaway, subtitled The Great Mistake of Scottish Independence. And it's by John Lloyd, published this year, 2020, by Polity Press in Cambridge. I'll say at the outset, it's not a staggeringly good piece of publishing. It's okay, it's all right, but it's got some weird mistakes. It's like saying in 1988, under the Blair government, the London Challenge came in. I mean, everybody knows Blair came into power in 1997, and you obviously you simply disregard that. But the thing is, you then wonder, what about the other things that you didn't know as a fact? Are they correct or not? Can you rely on them? And one major problem it has no index. This is the latest thing, to save money, I suppose. It has no index at all. So that's I've seen bad computer-generated indexes. This is the first book I've seen that purports to be a fairly serious study that has no index at all. Anyway, the basic point of this book is to argue the case for the Union against the SNP case, which covered last time, and I suppose in the spirit of balance we should cover this one as well. But unfortunately my balance doesn't extend to agreeing with things that I don't like. The subject matter misses the point, in my opinion. I will come to that, and the way it's presented is dull in the extreme, dull like this cloud that's above us at the moment. The cover is grey. The book is kind of grey, and it features a picture of the Union Jack in tatters. To me that symbolises the book. It's a grey book about, if you like, the negative sides of the pro-independence case, and there's a perfectly good case for independence, there's a perfectly good case against it. This book really doesn't make the case against it. The main point I'd like to make is that it misstates the whole case for independence. It reduces it to a matter of money. Now, to me, this is silly. I know that's what the SNP thinks in their great document that I discussed last time, Scotland's Future, is all about money, and you will have more money if Scotland's independent. I think it's a rather cheap, if one may make it a pun, a cheap argument. And it's a shame, because John Lloyd's a good bloke. John Lloyd, he has two qualities. Firstly, he was a very good journalist. He was the Financial Times correspondent in Moscow for many years. And also, he has one other quality which is relevant to the situation we find ourselves in after having read the previous book. And that is that he is an authentic Scot on the Mandy Rhodes definition. He was born in Anstruther, went to Edinburgh University, and fulfills all four of Mandy Rhodes' criteria, in that he's working class, state educated, left-leaning, and believably human. He's definitely believably human, unlike some of us. And he's definitely left-leaning, because he was a member of the Communist Party for a long time, can you believe it, in the 1970s. Then he joined the Labour Party, so you can hardly claim he isn't he doesn't have sort of lefty credentials. On page 123 and shortly thereafter, he goes into quite a lot of detail saying that the SNP's forecasts were ludicrously inaccurate, which they were. You know, with Scotland, the book said Scotland be wealthier than the UK due to oil, and the book was written in 2013 when the average price of Brent crude was $108 a barrel, but 2 years later it was down to 40, less than 40. Which it still is today. SNP projected a 9 billion surplus into Scottish Treasury. It's turned out to be nothing at all, and in fact there are some people who think that it might actually become a negative. You know, it might end up costing the country more because of decommissioning and unemployment and all sorts of things. And the point is, I don't understand why a serious, sophisticated, intelligent, authentically Scot journalist like John Lloyd doesn't draw attention to the fact that it's not a question of money, it's a question of the fact that a 300-year union isn't broken up on a price perspective for a commodity which goes up and down every day, and it's temporarily up, so we break up the union. You know, once something's broken, it's like a divorce, once it's broken, that's it, it's gone. It is such a cavalier approach to people's idea of government that it really ought to be attacked on that level, and I don't know why he doesn't do that. On page 148, where he quotes one commentator who says, and I think this is exactly right, and this is sort of my point, and I don't know why he doesn't make more of it. He says, I think most failures in Scotland have been policy failures, not implementation failures, and failures of government. It's a consequence of the government being a campaigning group. Pleasing as many constituencies as possible is most important. But it's also this business of pleasing things by taking things away from the wrong sort of people. Land reform is a case in point, as is, in a different sense, the threatening behaviour and abusive comments bill at football, or whatever it was called, which is now, it was such a disaster, it's actually been repealed. The only bill, as far as I know, the only act in the Scottish Parliament that's actually been repealed. But this was a way of pandering to supporters, not by giving them something, but by taking it away from somebody who they don't like. And I think that attitude to politics runs right the way through the SNP, and John Lloyd makes nothing of it whatsoever. However, he makes one quite good point here. On page 41, and party conferences are there to decide policy on the basis of what the members all agree to do. SNP have turned them, like most of the other parties these days, it has to be said, but they've done it more aggressively than most, I think it would be fair to say. They've turned them into stage-managed shows. Seeing the SNP in full conference for the first time in Aberdeen in March 2017 was to witness a party whose senior officials came to the microphone to say that, quote, I am fantastically proud of the leadership of the First Minister Nicola Sturgeon. That was Angus Robertson. And, quote again, Nicola Sturgeon, Alex Salmond, we are proud of them. That was Fiona Hislop, then Cabinet Minister for External Affairs. Much of the rest of the two-day event was taken up on the stage by people who were in one way or another grateful to the SNP government for helping them. One, a mother with 3 children and, quote, no confidence, said that once she had joined the SNP, her confidence picked up and she was standing in local elections as a councillor. A woman with multiple sclerosis said that the Tory government and the media had made, quote, our lives much worse, and that the SNP would get disabled people elected. A young man said he had come out as gay at 22 and said he had caused great pain. He had been caused great pain by being called a poof and a faggot. He broke down in tears. A woman said her daughter had been saved by the mental health system brought in by the SNP after she had slashed her wrists. Quote, other mothers shouldn't have to see their daughter standing in a school corridor dripping in blood, she said, and also broke down. A debate on immigration was largely taken up with justifying the government's encouragement to migrants and calling out I think he means criticising the government for barring entry. The individual stories appeared wholly sincere and were affecting. But what the conference was not was a debate between rival positions and proposals, usually the stuff of political parties' gatherings. A rare, brief example of this came when an SNP Westminster MP, Tommy Shepherd, the name means nothing to me, but I believe him, proposed a motion condemning Israel, quote, for the longest military occupation in the world. There's a grammar issue there, but we'll pass over that. A delegate opposed this motion, saying it sent the message that the party was one-sided on the issue. The motion was overwhelmingly passed without further debate. We are in the sort of realms of the Nuremberg rallies here. I don't mean that in the sense that they're fascist, in the sense of the appeal of politics is emotional. I'm now going to make a slightly different point in the sense that Lloyd does quote one thing, it's only a couple of sentences unfortunately, which is an extremely important point about the arguments for the Union, which he, in my opinion, he should have developed further, but he doesn't. This is on page 96, where he points out that Adam Smith was a great fan of the union with England, not least because it had brought greater freedom to working people. By the union with England, the middling and inferior ranks of people in Scotland gained complete deliverance from the power of an aristocracy which had always before oppressed them. That's a quote from The Wealth of Nations. The danger that we face in Scotland with a looming modern aristocracy of emotion, sentiment, and people bursting into tears at party conferences and being completely uninterested in discussing policy motions. An aristocracy of these sort of people is an incredibly dangerous thing.
Thank you, Angus. Angus, I think you have just seen and heard just how much we all love you. Delegates, at the risk of tempting fate, I've come prepared. Look after these for me. I told you he was a safe pair of hands.
If you don't share the emotions of the leadership, you don't really count. Now, Adam Smith, I suppose on the Mandy Rhodes test, wasn't an authentic Scot, because he wasn't left-leaning. Whether he's working class or not, I'm not sure. He was probably state-educated, although that's not in the sense she meant. Was he believably human? I mean, he never got married, so maybe he wasn't even believably human. So he's a totally an unauthentic Scot. Of course, people like Nicola Sturgeon quote him all the time as an authority for the genius and brilliance of Scotland. But yeah, I don't think he would have passed the Mandy Rhodes test. However, it seems to me that John Lloyd is not really making the most of his point here. He's got a series of good arguments which he makes very little of and concentrates on the demolishing the SNP's argument that we'll all be richer, which has been demolished anyway by the collapse in the oil price. And the COVID crisis too. There's two other points I'm going to make. The first one is that there is a real point about the union, which he doesn't mention at all. Maybe the Adam Smith comment is incredibly obliquely related to it, but so oblique that it's almost invisible. The main point about the Union is that it's there to preserve the rule of law, because I fear for the rule of law in Scotland today. When we have a government that doesn't discuss policy and conducts its party conferences as sort of sob fests. I think we're in danger of the rule of law going west, because this business of authentically Scots, emotion, you're heading into a government that is really not based on things people can vote on. And democracy is based on voting. And you don't vote by saying, oh, I love this person, I hate that person. And this is a very dangerous thing. The rule of law is under serious threat in Scotland today, and Britain was created in order to preserve the beginnings of the rule of law against the autocratic tendencies of Louis XIV, principally. It's withstood all sorts of other threats to the rule of law, like Hitler and the Kaiser, and so on and so on. Even the Cold War, you could say, quite frankly, though Britain's part in that was less proportionately, but it was not insignificant, and would have been a lot less significant if Scotland and England had been split up. To me, what Britain is about is the rule of law. It is the fundamental political value in the modern world. That's why my book is about Russia, the rule of law, because Russia's a wonderful country, beautiful people, all sorts of interest, but cursed with a leadership in the Kremlin which has come from Mongol roots. Its political customs have come from Mongol roots, and it doesn't understand the rule of law really, and to the extent it does, it absolutely wants to avoid it. And especially when you look at the Chinese situation, to me the battle of the world is the battle for the rule of law. The battle for the Union, to me, is the battle for the rule of law. And John Lloyd doesn't mention anything about it at all. What you do get, and this is extremely interesting, he devotes a good 20 pages or something to the position of the so-called artists in Scottish society, the poets particularly. And I'm just going to finish off by mentioning a few bits about this. There's a chapter called "To Be Yourself," which is about the, if you like, this identity politics behind the nationalist movement, not particularly the SNP, but the nationalist movement in general. And he quotes a couple of writers. I'm going to just mention two people. The first is James Kelman. And John Lloyd writes as follows: Kelman's detestation of the English is so great that he claims to read fiction from all other countries, the US, France, Russia, except England. Quote, I wouldn't have been reading English literature because of the class barrier. Why would you want to read things that were treating you as an animal? English literature treats James Kelman as an animal. Oh dear. But I suppose that's the USP, as we're supposed to say these days, of the authentic Scot. You have to think of yourself as maltreated by these sort of people. The other one, which I'll just mention a little bit at greater length, but not too long, is Hugh McDermott, famous Hugh McDermott, the mad, absolutely insane character. And I simply don't understand why people take this guy seriously. Poetry is unreadable. John Lloyd writes as follows: the enthusiasm for hating the English, which McDermott encouraged throughout his long life, was in the days before the SNP had to mind its public image marked. You'll recall that in 1931, he mentions here, he wrote the first hymn to Lenin. I'm sure most Russians will be pretty appalled at that, but you know, he's entitled to his opinion, but I don't see why it should be the model for anybody else. But it goes further. He says for his fellow Scots, he had mainly contempt, sneering at the moronic, quote, the moronic character of most of our people. So, last time we talked about Nicola Sturgeon having her entire political life motivated by hatred of Margaret Thatcher, and I remarked that we're dealing with a load of haters here. I mean, this is the same sort of thing. He hates the English, Kelman hates the English, McDermott hates the English, but McDermott also hates Scots. Even authentic ones, I dare say. Probably the more authentic, the worse they are. He also says that the Unionist Scots, that's people like John Lloyd, of course, were, in quotes, this is in quotes from McDermott, were Scotland's only enemies. So in other words, we could live happily ever after, writing hymns to Lenin, if only we could get rid of Unionist Scots. And finally, I'm going to draw your attention to this little bit on page 157, where Lloyd notes, in a remarkable PhD thesis for Glasgow University, the literary scholar Gerald Carruthers, now a professor at that university, began by throwing down a challenge to the dominant strain in Scots literature in the 20th century. He cites an incident in the 1962 Writers' Conference at the Edinburgh Festival, where MacDermot called Alexander Trochy, a Glaswegian who lived then in Paris, wrote pornographic novels, published an avant-garde magazine, and experimented with drugs. He called them cosmopolitan scum. Now, by complete coincidence, Alexander Trochy's nephew was at school with me in South Africa, in Johannesburg. How cosmopolitan is that? I mean, you can't go to Paris without being called cosmopolitan scum. He should have been in Glasgow having a horrible time. And really, I think we'll draw a discreet veil over the rest of MacDermot's poisonous output. My final point about this book is simply to say that if I were a nationalist, which I'm not, but if I were a nationalist, this wouldn't persuade me to become a unionist. However, it's well worth studying. Buy the book, see what you make of it, and let's hope somebody writes a better one explaining the real fundamental rule of law points about why Britain needs to stick together in an unfriendly world. Should Old Acquaintance Be Forgot by John Lloyd. That's today's book, and I am now going to sit back out of this wind and read myself, enjoy myself, because it is absolutely glorious weather.